Hello everyone. Welcome to Vocation Indonesia webinar series, UK academic and vocational expertise well positioned to support Indonesia's national human capital goals. I am Asti, Events Coordinator at Vocation Indonesia. Today we are joined by our three panelists, Graham Hastings Evans, the Managing Director of NOCN, David Butcher, Principal of the British School Jakarta and also board member of Vocation Indonesia, and last but not least, Justina Ris Sunarti, founder and director of Sekolah Victory Plus. Today's webinar will be moderated by Chris Ren, the executive director of Vocation Indonesia. And before we start, allow me to review the functionality of this webinar. Please be informed that today's webinar is being recorded and we will be able to share a link with you when it's available after this webinar is completed. All dial-in participants will be muted to avoid background noises that may distract you from listening to this webinar and also to enable our panelists to present without interruption. And if you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box at any time. It is at the bottom center of your screen. And we will have time for Q&A session at the end to answer your questions. Okay, now I'm going to hand the screen over to Chris Ren to start today's webinar.
Thank you very much, Asti. Good afternoon to everybody that is joining us in Indonesia and around the Southeast Asia region. A good morning to those who are checking in from the UK or around Europe. It's a pleasure for me to welcome you all. The subject of education, human capital is a very, very topical one here in Indonesia. We as a Chamber of Commerce, as you well know, have established what we call the Business Confidence Index, established 7 years ago. It's a barometer and gauge of what businesses domiciled in Indonesia are experiencing as risks and challenges. And over the 7 years, it's been quite consistent. If we take out the usual challenges, which might be regarded as the regulatory environment, legal uncertainty, and on a reducing basis, corruption, the other one that is consistently there and consistently significant is the challenge of acquisition, development, and retention of talent. So the human resource issue is very, very important and very, very challenging for businesses in their quest to achieve potential. As we know, Indonesia has a number of goals, and among those goals cited right now is that it is well positioned to be able to compete with, in the past, it's been Vietnam in its challenge to acquire many of those businesses that strategically now have committed to diversifying their supply chain out of China. But is Indonesia ready to do so? Is there sufficient human resource to be able to match the needs of many international businesses? So these are issues that we intend to discuss. We'll also look at the fact that Indonesia has produced tens upon tens upon tens of thousands of students each and every year. They all have their S1, which is that undergraduate qualification, but it doesn't seem that many of those students have actually been meeting the expectations of business and are rarely ready to get to work. What can be done about that? Of course, we all know that in recent times, just after President Jokowi's second installation as President of the Republic of Indonesia, in his cabinet, he placed a new Minister of Education, and this new minister has very, very clearly vowed to embark on a series of transformations. So it's a great pleasure to welcome Graham, Justina, and David. I won't go through their CVs, and bios. They've all been there and available to you. And as we have a relatively short period of time to delve into some of the questions that we want to ask around this, I'll defer to the fact that but I'd like to begin first of all, if I may, by inviting him to do a little bit of scene setting, in particular in the context of NOCN, which is perhaps an organization people in Indonesia might yet not know so much about. So a little bit of background, please. What NOCN does, in particular, its interest and focused at the moment on Southeast Asia and, of course, in Indonesia.
Thank you very much, Chris. Good afternoon, everybody. It's actually morning here in the UK. NOCN is an awarding organisation and an assessment organisation in the UK. We are a charity. We've been around for well over 30 years. In the UK, we're one of the big awarding organisations like Pearson, City and Guilds and others whose names that you will probably have heard. And about 6 years ago, we decided as a charity, we wanted to support people outside of the UK, and we've been steadily expanding our footprint internationally. We started in Europe, then the Middle East. In the last 5 years, we've been in India, and we saw it as a natural progression to move on to support people in Asia and Southeast Asia. There was a logical step for us. There was an understanding of the British educational system and strong historical links, and that's really driven our strategy around supporting people outside of the UK. So what do I mean by the support that we give people and what we're trying to do? We obviously set examinations, we deliver qualification certificates, not in academic subjects. We are purely technical, vocational, educational topics. Yeah? Being a bricklayer, a hairdresser, a retailer, a manager. So that's what we're all about, giving people the skills to actually deliver an occupation. And we do that from the base operative, which might be somebody answering the phone in a call center, or working on a construction site, or serving in a shop, all the way up to strategic managers with the equivalent of master's qualifications. So broad range, and we do that in a large number of sectors. We've been working in India for the last 5 years, and I think the area that we find exciting is the idea of apprenticeships, as well as technical education. An apprenticeship which embodies the technical qualification, but also includes the practicing and the practical aspects of that. We think that is a game changer for people. If we look at what happened in the UK, we had a very strong, like Europe, apprenticeship program in the 70s and 80s. Then, rather like Indonesia, and I've seen it in America, and I've also seen it in India very recently, people thought it was better to go and get a degree, yes, and to move away from technical and vocational education. And I think we've all found that that's not the right route. Many countries have found that they've ended up with large numbers of people with degrees that the employers aren't interested in. Yeah, so people have got into debt, they spend a lot on education, they haven't got something that's then worthwhile for them. And what we've been doing is to try to provide people with a qualification or an apprenticeship which actually does deliver that makes them employable, gives them the skills to be productive, and skills which embody the new technologies. We've all had the challenge of COVID over the last 4 or 5 months, varies country by country as to when that started with you. But I think we've all now learned the use of technology is going to be critical to be competitive, and you must have the practical skills to be competitive. If you in the Far East, in Indonesia, want to compete against China, then you need to be able to have the same sort of skills to be able to compete. And pure academic skills just don't cut it for most employers, and they don't cut it out there in the workplace. So those are the areas that we've been very keen to expand upon, very keen to develop. We've been working on apprenticeship schemes in India, and in fact we've had recent discussions with the US as well, and within Malaysia. So very keen to help Indonesia develop the skills that it needs, that industry want. The things we do are driven by industry demands, yes? What they need now in technology, what they might need in a few years' time in technology, not by the academic route, yes? I read a recent survey in India where employers felt that 75% of people coming out of university were unemployable. Now, I don't know what the similar figure is in Indonesia, but there are similar figures in the UK, and we've made vast changes. For the last 5 years, we are reducing the number of people going to university to study purely academic studies from something like over 50%, which was a target at one stage, to around 30%. And we're putting those people onto more practical courses, including something called a degree apprenticeship, which I won't go into detail, but actually prepares you to be a doctor, an engineer, yes, a professional, an accountant, etc., in a much more practical way than just getting an academic course. I hope that's a useful introduction. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Graham. Some very, very interesting points there. And I think it gives me an opportunity to bring in David Butcher immediately. David, as we know, as introduced by Asti, is the principal of the British School, Jakarta. I suppose if you were to put the British School into a category, it might be regarded as elite in what it does. But I understand more recently, David, the IB has been extended to include a C, and that C has an interesting connotation that might well overlap with some of the points that Graham was making.
Thanks, Chris, and to everybody here on behalf of the school. We hope that you're healthy and in a good place with your families. And it's been a kind of bonkers last 4 months for all of us, and our switch to campus closure online learning was something that we had to live with and deal with, and I think we did it really well. But I think what you're talking about, Chris, is the whole idea of not just having one exit stream from certain schools, and you said that we're an elite school. We're an educational business that provides quite a high quality service. And what we realized was that rather than just trying to get people through the IB diploma where they would struggle, would to be as a good school, and as Graham points out, to be more relative with our education, was to introduce the IB's careers-related program, the IBCP. Why? Well, we wanted to make sure that the educational journey at BSJ was one that they could enjoy. And one of the preconceptions about the IB diploma is that it's academically rigorous, that it actually is too demanding for certain students. And as a school, we said, well, okay, we can provide a different alternative. We can have a different form of assessment. They can still go to university. They may not go to the best universities, but they'll go to universities and they will enter in courses where they've had experience throughout their 16 to 18-year-old education with us. And we've started the program. We started it last year. So we just started in year 2 as we go back in August. And we started with business and management. Why? Well, we felt that from a vocational point of view, it would be a good lead-in and a good start for us in terms of attracting students and also giving them the skills to follow that in at a more vocational level, at tertiary level in universities. So it was to really create a different stream and to accommodate and to allow students to work at their own level and be successful.
Thank you very much, David. Justina, I know that you have a particularly solid knowledge in terms of the background of the development of education in Indonesia. I'm just going to make a generalization, and that generalization is that actually Indonesia, unlike its neighboring countries, has been very, very closed and, shall we say, reluctant in terms of international engagement and collaborations with regards to its education, whether it's at a younger level or late teens or going into university. First of all, why do you think that reluctance has prevailed? And we all sense that perhaps that is going to change. And what do you think the benefits and the opportunities will be for Indonesia if that does change?
Okay, I think the one that you mentioned earlier, that in the past, it seems that the government is so reluctant for accepting a kind of something from another country. I think nowadays there is a kind of a opportunity, because like a school like ours, it used to be very difficult in terms of the accreditation and everything. And by the leadership of the new minister, I think they are more open to that for the current or the present situation, because they also believe that the students need to be global in terms of the competition. They have to be able to compete with other other graduates from other countries, and they are expected to also work borderless. It means that they also have to be able to work overseas. But then yet, at the moment, if you're talking about vocational schools, actually the government offer a lot of kind of choices or options. There are around 9 options, from kind of arts and go on further to the automotive technical things and everything. But yet you mentioned about the accreditation or a kind of certification from overseas. I think it's really important, because we want to make sure there is a kind of a kind of standardized thing from not only the internal Indonesia, but also from other countries, which is standard. So that's something that is important, I think.
Yes, thank you. I mean, I think it's generally accepted that education standards overall, and I am generalizing, in neighboring countries such as Singapore and Malaysia are much higher than in Indonesia. And probably Indonesia does need more than simply to make a statement that actually we've been working hard and we are improving our standards. And one of the best ways to demonstrate that as a matter of irrefutable fact is to embrace some type of international standard or of certification by way of proof. I'm just wondering, Graham, first, whether you've got examples around the world where NOCN has been engaged in the past and is presently, where the use of standards has really been the perfect tool by way of proof to provide business and industry with the confidence to embrace investment in a country and be confident that it can develop in that country.
Yes, thanks, Chris. By way of that, we're involved in WorldSkills as well, which is obviously an international standard for skills. But I think there's an emerging recognizing need that if you want to have a competitive business and industry, you've got to be able to operate at a level where you are at an international standard. If your people want to go and study abroad or work abroad, they need to be able to hit that standard. If you want to sell your goods and services internationally, you're going to have to hit that standard. and people are going to expect your workforce to be able to deliver at an international level. We've been involved in both the Middle East and India over a number of years. The Middle East has embraced a standard which is the international standard, built upon the European and the British experience. They see it as actually critical for them. They are oil countries, and oil will decline. They've got to restructure the whole of their industries. They've got to restructure the way their economy works. And they have seen that they've got to move towards an international standard of skills. And that's been happening over the last 4 or 5 years. And you can start to see that happen. You can see the diversification away from oil in the Middle East, yeah, as absolutely economic, crucially important. And I understand that that's going to happen in other parts of the world, yes, including ASEAN, that move away from oil to different types of industry. In India, they've got a growing population, they've got a young population. They have decided to embrace international standards as a way of increasing the skills of their workforce, to produce their own motor cars, to produce technologies around recycling and the use of energy. We're working across India in a number of technical and engineering manufacturing sectors that are moving, and civil engineering sectors that are moving towards international standards. Two primary reasons why India is doing that, and we're working with a number of states and the government and some not-for-profit private training centres. Young people will want to move outside of India because they can see that as the European and, well, perhaps other countries, not just Europe, as the populations age, there's going to be demand for skilled people, younger skilled people. So they can see an opportunity to move, to take their young people and allow them to go and work abroad. In order to do that, they need an international certificate, yes, because they will just not be recognized by the employers in Europe or Japan or other parts of the world. Or if they want to sell their goods and develop into international companies like Tata and others that are doing that in India, they need to have people with international qualifications and international standard skills. So your near neighbor in India, which is a large proportion of the world's population, has also already seen the importance of going down this road, and is probably a couple of years ahead, I would think, of Indonesia. But is demonstrating why it needs to do it. Yes, and as is other parts of the world. Thanks.
Isn't there a double-edged sword for a country like Indonesia, though? So on the one hand, yes, accepted that need people of better qualification, people who can prove that they have learned and can do to an international standard. But at the same time, if you provide this sort of qualification, you also de facto encourage mobility, whereby the country loses the top talent and it goes to work in other countries, as you've just said, Graham. I just wonder if you'd just like to comment on that from me, and then perhaps we'll talk to David about some of his experiences in other parts of the world as well.
I think that is a genuine challenge, but I also see a lot of young Indian people who have gone to the States or Europe or Britain, and they've then taken those skills back, yes, and therefore the Indian economy is benefiting from people going abroad. I did a degree apprenticeship in engineering. I worked in the Middle East, I've worked in Thailand, and I've gone back home and I've brought back greater skills. And I can see that happening in both the Middle East and I can see it happening in India. And I don't think we should be afraid of people moving around the planet and steadily increasing their human capital and therefore then be able to go back home. I think the challenge it faces for obviously any country is that it needs to be able to demonstrate that it can provide people with a good salary and a good career prospects when they come back into the country. Yeah? So they can't just think, I'm going to educate everybody and let them go abroad. You've got to educate everybody, but also provide them with opportunities back at home as well.
People moving around the world, well, that's an interesting concept in these times, isn't it? Not a lot of mobility at all, but for different reasons.
I think
David,
change.
yes, David, I know you've worked in different countries, and it might surprise some people that it's a country not so far from the UK and assumed to have always been quite sophisticated in terms of its education, which provides an interesting case study.
Yeah, just following on from Graham, I particularly think of having lived in South America and Europe and the Middle East. I think Indonesia, the DNA of young Indonesians is to maybe get their education overseas and learn it well, but also bring it back. Certainly, I feel that at the school that there's this intrinsic belief that they can do both, and I believe we constantly review and reflect about providing that education for them to come back, because the opportunities that are going to be here in the next 10 years, I think, are going to be boundless, and it's up to us to make sure that's the case. In reference to what you're saying, I think that prior to living here, I lived in the Netherlands, and I think the Netherlands were very clever in actually adopting vocational education in a new way, realizing that in Europe that universities were becoming more expensive, and they attracted in the 6 years that I was there a number of courses increased with English as the lead language for the universities, and we had the old sort of traditional universities and the new universities that began accepting the idea that it wasn't all about getting qualifications, it was learning on the course, as it were. And we actually changed the government decree to allow something like the IB careers related program to be accepted into Dutch universities from inside within the Netherlands, because we felt that this was, again, something important, that it was about choice. And if you talk to a lot of parents in my school or in Justina's school, it'll be the parents saying, we want them to be a lawyer, a doctor, a businessman, or economics, banker, whatever. And actually, when you talk to the students, they may be having different ideas. And the blend of that is to educate the parents that the world's going to change in the next 15, 20 years, and there's going to be new jobs that we've never heard of, that are going to be more vocational, more skill related. And I think that the Netherlands got it right in offering these types of courses where students can have a greater apprenticeship or a year out in the business itself and learning in that capacity. What we would have called the old sandwich course back in when I was at university. But these things are becoming fashionable again for the right reasons, which is that it's not necessarily the qualification that gets you, it's the skills and your adaptability to a profession that is going to serve you well. I think, we all look at stats, and you hear regularly that an undergraduate will go into his first job. Within 10 years, they may have had 5 jobs already, one every 2 years, crossing professions, which is going to be a reality that we face. Whereas 25 or 30 years ago, we graduated in a profession and we're still in it because that's the way it was. And so I think everything that Graham's doing, I applaud. And I think that, us as a school, we want to make sure that there is that scope and that positive energy about the options that are out there for both the students, but also for the families as well.
Thank you, David. Justina, David is clearly highlighting that it's not necessarily the piece of paper that's important, it's the skills and what a graduated student can actually offer to a business that is important. Your school, I understand, is the first school in Bekasi to offer IB, and I'm sure as such, many of the parents are very much driven in the same way as David has described to push their sons and their daughters into some of these traditional and elite professions. What sort of, first of all, do you agree with David? And also, what is your approach to this phase of education that perhaps Indonesian parents need to begin to appreciate the piece of paper is less important than the substance and the quality of the education that is behind it?
Okay. First, I want to say that I agree with what David mentioned, especially Indonesian parents. They really, appreciate if their children got a kind of certification for their university degrees. So they have a degree. And usually they prefer like the kind of a profession that is also respected here, such as like being a doctor, being a lawyer that you mentioned earlier. However, nowadays, because everyone is unique, all of our students are also unique, not everyone is very strong in academic, or they are not, they are more to a kind of a really skills-based things. So I think for the vocational schools, it is still very needed. And some of the parents have already being open-minded, and they think that if the children study something which can be used in their life, which is life-worthy and also ready to be used for working, then that they also appreciate that too. So I think now our parents, there are two kinds of parents. The ones who are thinking like degree is very important, certificates are very important, and then the ones who are open to the children's interests. So in our school, our graduates, some of them took the vocational schools, like being in the in the hotel management, and also some of them took like logistic management, which they have kind of the skills to be used when they graduate. And they also have some thought about going overseas. But if in Indonesia there is a kind of institution offering a better quality standard of vocational schools, and also it is certified and reputable with international standards, I think they are prone to that more than sending the children overseas. I think this is due to the cost and financial as well. So that's what I can say about the.
Okay. Thank you, Justina. I'd just like to stay with you, if I may, just at the moment. One of the challenges for Indonesia or for Indonesian people is a lot of the trade bodies and associations, Justina, they have their own standard, the Indonesian standard, and they're reluctant to embrace or work with an international standard. Now, I'm not sure whether that's fear that the gap between the two standards may become too apparent, too obvious, or there might be other reasons. But it does seem to be a fact. I know that there are a number of British chartereds, for example, that are working very, very hard to have their standards accepted by different trade groups and trade associations. How do you think organizations, and I suppose organizations like NOCN that Graham heads up, how do you think that they can approach and get a different sort of and much more progressive reception from these trade bodies who are locked into, no, this is the Indonesian way, this is the Indonesian standard, and there's not an awful lot we want to learn from an international partner?
I think I am not into the kind of, I know the educational department better because usually we are linked to them. So I think what I can say is that approach them to have a kind of a experience, especially for the teachers, for the vocational schools, to have a kind of a training with like a body like the NOC, and after that they will see the difference of the standard. And after that, of course, later on they can also transfer what they learn in the training to the students, and then the students also will feel, oh, this is different. And I think the institution then will, like in our school, we are implementing the IB, and we feel that the standard for IB is different from the national. So which is in IB, it is more holistic. And how did we know about it? Of course, by joining a kind of training, and then we train all of the teachers, and we know the standard is different. And I think at the moment, the ones which are already implementing this an international standard is in the formal education, like the vocational, like what you mentioned. We really need to influence the teachers first. This is in my opinion. And after that, we go on to the institution. So after that, then the needs, because the students feel the difference, and the parents will see that that one is a kind of a better quality. Then bit by bit, there are two options of choices, which is international standards and national standards. And of course, it also relates to, again, for the customers, it relates to the finance as well. Sometimes maybe we were worried that the price is going to be doubled or tripled when the word international standard is coming into place.
Okay, and I think we have all speakers have referred to a role of the private sector here, and I suppose if cost is the issue and the beneficiary is going to be business, then perhaps the opportunity is to have many more of these collaborations involving business. Graham, what would you say to that?
I think it's crucial to have business engaged within the technical skills development, because you will then understand what they need and better align yourself to it. Each country has a different way of funding technical education. In the UK, we have a levy. A lot of countries have levies on employers as a means of encouraging either apprenticeships or technical training, and ensuring that employers are engaged. I think our experience of that over a number of years, and there was a period when we disengaged from employers in the 90s because we thought it was better for everybody to go to university, but we've corrected that. I think the experience of countries that have got employers embedded in it, but also then build some form of funding arrangement, yes, which encourages employers and gives them actually an incentive to engage, is important. You don't have to have a levy. There might be other ways of doing it, but I think you've got to get industry and technical skills development together, yes, working together. And the benefit of what we've done with our new apprenticeships over the last 3 to 4 years and our new T levels, yes, which will be equivalent to an A level for people to go on into work or a further apprenticeship. We've got employers embedded right the way within that. So these are children who are 16 to 19. They're going to go and do a vocational study, yes, in being an engineer or preparing to be a doctor or whatever it is, yes, or a banker, yes. They're going to study that, and the employers are at the table. They're deciding what the curriculum is, yes, and heavily engaged in it. And I think you start to see massive changes when you get employers engaged early on in the process.
Thanks, Graham. And just for your information and from any UK-based participants, actually Indonesia, through its omnibus law, is proposing to introduce tax credits for employers or rather that can be can be credited against investment that's made in human resource training and development. So it's a slightly different way of achieving a similar sort of result. It's an incentive rather than a cost to the business. David, I saw you writing furiously as Graham was speaking, so I sense that you've got something to add on this point.
Well, I think, you know, education is at a tipping point at the moment. I'm not sure, and Graham and I haven't had this conversation, but something that the other heads of international schools, we're very concerned about, obviously, is a year where, for example, our students in the IB diploma didn't do their final examinations, and they're going to go through, they're going to get their results on Monday. But is it the time where, because of what's happened with the COVID pandemic, that we can actually start addressing the universities and having real discussions about assessment criteria and about what we need to get in? Because if ever there was a tipping point, I think this is the time. And you're going to have one cohort that's going to go through, and I think we're very lucky with the International Baccalaureate that we had so much information and so much knowledge of their academic ability. It was now, we've given them a great reflection, and maybe other courses didn't have that because everything was riding on the last exam. It's one of these moments where you, in your career and in your lifespan, in particularly in education, do we think we're actually going to make a positive difference now? Because, you know, I listened to the apprenticeship schemes. I think it's a great idea. Ourselves, we have our own director of entrepreneurship. Why? Because the skills of that, I think, are vital for any young student between the age of, 8 and 16 or 18 at the moment, because what's going to happen in the world as we go forward. So those are the kind of big ticket items. And Justina talked about holistic education. Well, that can be serviced anywhere in the world. It's just the whole child and actually doing it in a different way. We're talking about qualifications, we're talking about courses, we're talking about excelling and getting to the best universities, and we're not going to stop doing that. But it's the student and the self, and the time for agility and flexibility in being able to offer courses across the bandwidth of what we need to do for the students, I think, is the conversations we need to start having. I don't know if my colleagues feel differently or feel the same. I'd be interested to hear their views.
Would either Graham or Justina like to respond to that? And after you do, I'm going to invite a very interesting question from Ivan, who we've brought up onto the panel. But Graham, Justina, Graham first.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that. I think the one thing that we've all learned in the last 4 or 5 months is the benefit of the technologies hold out to us. The fact that here we are today speaking internationally. A year ago, I'd have got on an aeroplane and we'd all been in a big hotel somewhere in Jakarta. So we've started to see that. Our organisation was based in 3 offices. In 48 hours, we based everybody from home. We continue to operate without disruption. And we've done a lot of work within the UK of adapting our assessment methodologies quite considerably as a result of COVID, and to adapt our teaching, the way that we teach. We are using new technology more than we ever did. And the technology was there, we just didn't use it. Yes, perhaps a reluctance, a bit frightened of it or whatever, not used to it. But we've made a rapid change. I don't think we're ever going to go back to what it was like in February. Yes, where people went into classrooms and learnt, or went into laboratories or workshops or whatever. And I think what we've found is that we can use the technology to assess people, and that we've done, so that it doesn't detract from the result. Yes, because we don't want the cohort of 2020 to be seen as a poor cohort. Yes, compared to others. So we've adapted that using technology, and we're adapting teaching, and I think that will have fundamental implications across the whole of the skills and education sector, right the way across the world. You know, you might find somebody can do their degree from Sheffield Hallam, who normally from Malaysia would have travelled there. There's a lot of Malaysian students and Indonesian students go to Sheffield, which is my local university, I suppose. If they put most of the course online, then suddenly a large number of people wouldn't be travelling. They'd actually start to do a lot of the learning online. They would travel a bit because there's certain things that they would need to do. But I think you're going to get a totally different blended way of both teaching and of assessing people. Yes, and we've already started to do that. We're moving to proctoring. We're moving to the use of a lot of online examinations and testing and assessments, use of video capture, etc., etc. Big changes.
Just on what you've said about students traveling to Hallam, Sheffield Hallam, and whether they would or they wouldn't. I know you're aware, Graham, that we've recently established the Britcham Education Centre, which is focused on relationships with universities based on employability. But one thing that we're doing right now, in fact, it will go out this week to between 500 and 700 alumni, is asking the question if they were actually planning to go to the UK for August, September 2020, would they continue with their enrollment, knowing that at least a part of their program was going to be done online? So we're really asking the question, you know, how critical are all those non-academic components to being in a country, the cultural appreciation, the language development, and so on and so forth. So we'll keep everybody informed when we get those results. We have invited Ivan onto the panel so that he can ask a personal question, and his question really puts into context, when considering any solutions for just about anything for Indonesia, just how big and diverse the country is. Ivan, please ask your question.
All right. Thank you very much, Chris and Britcham, for organizing this really insightful web seminar. So my name is Ivan from Ewing Group. We have been running a joint venture for renewable energy, and we're also working with a BP subsidiary for doing this business in Indonesia. And welcoming talents is also a very challenging issue for us, especially in this field of industry where there's still a minimum of talents in Indonesia for renewable energy. So my question is related to today's seminar is about how actually we are able to pursue an international standardization, considering that Indonesia have a vast population, archipelagic in nature, where we have more than 17,000 islands and people are living in everywhere separately. And also we are multicultural in terms of culture. We have, I think, more than 800 tribes in Indonesia. But I know that the president right now have a really strong focus on education, and I think that more and more local governments are trying to pull more and more budget towards education. But I think that they need to have a clear direction on how they can make sure that the talents that they will provide more support can be ensured that they are able to be adopted to the international standard and becoming a talent that have a global competence. So I would like to have your views on regarding this issue, and maybe this can enlighten us, and especially during this COVID-19 times, with online education becoming a more important. So how also you can accommodate this condition of COVID-19 in terms of answering the question that I asked just now. Thank you very much. I appreciate it for the opportunity.
So Justina, in the context of Indonesia's huge size, just what can be done to provide greater opportunity, particularly in those areas? I mean, Ivan introduced himself as being from the renewable energy sector, and being tremendously challenged in terms of finding the right talent. How can Indonesia get over this size, diversity, and so on, in trying to get relevant education and opportunity for different qualifications?
I think Ivan was mentioning that he mentioned the right condition at the moment because of the huge size of Indonesia. So usually we pay attention only to the big cities. And then we forgot that people in other places, they really need a kind of a better quality of English. I think if we are going to embrace the international standard of education, one thing is the main thing, we need to improve their English standard. And it is so difficult to find great or bright students with great English from places not from big cities. So that's one thing that we need to improve, their English competencies. And after that, they can be trained in any kinds of field that is needed, like the renewable energy, something like that. I think that's one thing that I noticed from accepting students from outside Jakarta or Bekasi, because we also have some students coming from other places. When the parents are sent to the capital city for working, then they are looking for schools with English background, English medium of communication. And we found that their English competency really different from the big cities. That's number one. And then I think I agree with what Pak Ivan mentioned, that it is a bit difficult to find students or talents which are interested in that renewable energy, because sometimes we are limited to exposure of what is it like actually. The most exposure that they get is that being a doctor, being a lawyer, right? So we really need to have a kind of explanation about what is it all about, and then how can you learn and what kind of prospective work that they are going to get in the future. So usually we have a kind of career day when we invite all of the expertise from different kinds of professions. And that's the time when they are opening their mind, oh, there is a kind of a field like this and like that. That's what I can say, Chris. Maybe David can add, or.
Well, Graham's put his hand up, so he's obviously keen and biting at the bit, and we'll let him have a go first. Sorry, let's have Graham first and David next. Graham first and David next.
Okay, I'd like to build on Justina's. One component is clearly language, and we have been moving towards working with partners that have got online English learning, and we've got obviously online examinations that overcomes that. We've been working in the Middle East, and we've been working in India. India is a big, diverse country. You know, each state is very different with its own different languages. They have the issue of, you know, a population, large numbers of people in cities of 10 million, and then, you know, enormous numbers of people out in the rural areas. And we've been working in India now for 5 years. In the last year or so, what we've been doing is to move everything online. So we've got international qualifications which have been, they've got the essence of the technology, yes, the international technology, but they're adapted for the local culture, yes. And you know, they're online, so people can sit an online examination, they can be tested, they can be, you're opening access, you've got that problem, and it's you've got to use the technology, you've got to tackle language, as Justina said, but you've got to open up people's opportunity to learn and to get to the international standard using the new technology. And we've been doing that with recycling in the Middle East, and we'll be doing that in India as well. So that's the trick, use the technology, yeah? Happy to have a chat separately at some stage on more of the detail, but that's the way of cracking it, yeah.
Thank you for being patient, David.
And also, one thing I think we talk about online learning, yes, this is the case. We still want to go back to face-to-face. We as a profession, we all miss the students enormously, and we're actually planning for August, and we're going to open the school, and you know, it'd be great to have those students back in. But in the meantime, if you take what the question was about in terms of, from a systemic point of view, this is where I think Indonesia can really learn from, say, the IB. I'll use that because I know most about that. You've got an organisation that crosses about 150 countries around the world with 5,000 schools, and it does have to standardise everything. So that every time that there's a result or there's an upgrade or something that's going to have an impact, it has an impact. It doesn't matter that the school can be a state school in America, it can be a private school in Peru, it could be a school in Jakarta and whatever, but we all have to follow the same principles and practices. And the people you have to educate first are really the teachers. And the moving away from the traditional side of what is in some ways still going on in many educational systems in the world at the moment is one of the biggest blockers. And if you start to educate on how we can assess differently by using online capacity, if it's available, or just starting to say, it's time to move it forward, then you're going to get this positive traction in how to do it and how to actually work so that whether you're in Surabaya or in Bali or anywhere in Indonesia, everybody adheres to the same standard. And that's going to be vital. And I think that I think there's going to be traction from what I understand. If you're still as more informed than I am about what's happening in the education system, but I know there's a willing, and if you grab that, it can be very, very beneficial. And I think what we're all talking about is, blending it all. There's going to be online, there's going to be face-to-face, there's going to be assessment, but we can all actually learn from each other and make it so that this wonderful country can do it really well in the future.
So I think we're hearing more and more that actually, although this pandemic has caused a huge amount of disruption in all aspects of life, out of it also there is a sense of great opportunity if we can all learn to take forward some of the things that we've had to do, things that were available to us that we perhaps didn't use in the past. So, and education is clearly one of those areas in particular which can benefit. Thank you very much for joining us, Ivan. It was a very relevant question, and my team would be happy to connect you with our panelists if you want to follow up on that. Mindful that we're coming towards the end of our 1 hour slot. And so in a moment, I'll just be asking for a few final comments from each of our panelists. But it would be remiss of me not to share a very relevant development with BritCham as well, with our listeners at the moment. As mentioned, BritCham has established its education centre. It is building its panel of universities. The qualifications that we will be in particular focusing on with those universities do revolve around employability. Employability also that coincides with and aligns with national goals and gaps in the human talent supply. But another thing that we're doing, again, directly related to this webinar, is we will be working with NOCN for BritCham to provide a particular endorsement of different types of training and development programs that are on offer from among our membership. So it could be companies that have their own training and development departments, create their own content, whereby they want that content accredited and endorsed, so that the standard can be accepted, and in turn will hopefully it will improve the quality of the teams that they have. It will serve as something that might encourage loyalty, but will also provide opportunities for the recipients to have greater mobility themselves within their careers. So with that, I guess that leads on to Graham making perhaps just a little comment about that if you'd like to, Graham, and then just a couple of closing comments as well in the context of NOCN and Indonesia.
Thanks, Chris. No, we're delighted to be working with you and to support the development of skills in Indonesia in a practical way. I think the comment that I'd like to sort of leave people with is that in the whole area of technical skills, you need to have employers bought into this. You need to embrace employers so that you can skill people with the right employability skills, the right language skills, the right technical skills, and the work ethic is a phrase that's used by a lot of employers. So those employers can work with those people. They can be competitive. They can offer competitive products and services in what is a global market. Yes, the world has shrunk as a result of COVID, and we've all got to recognize that we're not living in our little isolated fortress on a particular island. We are an island. I know there are many islands in Indonesia. We've got to recognize that we are in a global economy that will get more and more global and more integrated as time goes on. And we need to make sure our young people and our workforce have got the skills to cope with that type of economy.
Thank you, Graham. Justina.
I think this is the right moment to introduce a kind of benchmarking or standardized vocational school, because nowadays I think most of the standardization or certification is for the formal school with academic emphasis. So I think because the government nowadays is opening that kind of opportunity, and we can also embrace that and then make the quality of the vocational schools here more improved in terms of being able to go globalized, and also the standard is improving. And then the students can also have a kind of opportunity to learn about, like what Graham mentioned, the culture of work, the work ethic and everything. I referred to what my son's experienced. My son graduated from the Glasgow School of Art, majoring in architecture, and he learned a lot of practical things, and also learned about how to put the creativity into action. So I think that's something that is different. So I'm sure with the kind of benchmark or the standardized internationally, especially from an OC and OCN, I think it is going to improve the quality of vocational education in Indonesia.
Thank you, Justina. And I think your son also probably will have learned a slightly different style of English at Glasgow as well. And just mentioning English, before I bring David on to his closing remarks, we did have a question from Sonia of Cambridge Assessment English. And I believe, Sonia, that your question was answered in relation to the importance of English language by Justina and endorsed by both our other panelists. So we will consider that covered, and thank you for the question. To David.
Well, thanks, Chris, and thanks, Justina and Graham, for your insight this afternoon. It's always good to hear opinions and what's going forward in this quite turbulent time. Really proud of the fact that we can still get our students to the best universities in the world and to do those courses, and I don't think that's going to change. I think that what I take away from today is just the need for agility in our educational model, and the agility will come from like-minded people understanding about vocational education and actually educating people as to what that is, because sometimes there's a misconception or a wrong perception about vocation, about careers related. What we're actually doing is we're saying that there are really good courses for very bright students who can be successful, but the skills that we're going to teach are going to be slightly different. They're going to be more conducive to the way that they want to learn. And so if we offer those different levels, then we're doing a real service for people who can then bring it back to your country, whether they go overseas or whether they stay in country for their higher education. That's a choice. But if we offer them the opportunity to build their skills level across the board, and they have that enjoyment of it, I think it's an exciting time. And we don't know what's going to happen. We really don't know what's going to happen in terms of tertiary education. If you listen to what's happening in the UK and the opening of, or the not opening of some universities in September, if you look at what the the pressure that's on, particularly in the Americas as well. So we've got to be prepared for change. And I think these are the conversations that are really, really important to have at this time, because we always talk about, at BSJ, we talk about 2030. And we know that graduates in 2030 from our school or from university in that year who've been at our school will be entering a different world. And the skills are going to be the most important part of that. So thank you.
Excellent closing comments from all three panelists. And just before I wrap, I'd first of all like to extend our appreciation, the appreciation of British Chamber of Commerce in Indonesia to Graham Hastings-Evans, who is the Managing Director of NOCN and currently talking to us from somewhere around Sheffield in the UK. To Justina, first time engaged with BritCham. We're delighted to have had you as a panelist, Justina. Thank you very much for joining us. Justina is the founder and director of Sekolah Victory Plus in Bekasi, and to David Butcher, who's principal of the British School Jakarta and also a board member of the British Chamber. I just love the positive, upbeat sound of the concluding remarks. Yes, things have been really challenging, but these are exciting times. And if we just embrace the opportunities to change and act on change, then there's a very, very bright future for students, for nations, and that the UK has a place, a very important place to use as experience to be able to collaborate and be a great partner to a country like Indonesia. With that, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us. As mentioned by Asti, there will be a recording of this sent to each of you. Please do share it across your various social media networks, and to try and get as many people as possible to listen to some of the very valuable insights that we've had today. Just to mention to you that the Professional Women's Group will be back with an absolutely great offering on Thursday the 2nd of July. Consumer behavior in the new normal. Like most countries, Indonesia needs people to start spending and spending big again in order to help the country alleviate some of the pressure around all the different subsidies and support that it has had to give its population and business. So that is on July the 2nd, and a great lineup. We're also looking at renewable energy. Ivan, if you're still there and listening, this might be for you. July the 7th, together with our British Embassy, and some opening remarks will be made by our ambassador, Owen, in relation to that. And then we begin a triple header environmental series where BritCham is really looking into its role with COP26, the host in 2021. In Glasgow for the climate change discussions, and we begin with corporate climate commitments and the role of forest restoration projects. And again, an excellent lineup of experts joining us for that, and that is on Thursday the 9th of July. So three great webinars to come in the next week. To all of you, we wish you well. As always, follow guidance, be safe. We look forward to welcoming you to another BritCham webinar very, very soon. David, Graham, Justina, my team, Asti, and all the team, thanks very much indeed. Bye-bye.